a good question. I think the answer always is both. We've seen tremendous advances in the way people's communications are protected since 2013, the foremost of which is the adoption and embrace of pervasive encryption. This is the idea that in another 10 years there won't be unencrypted communications on the internet. Encryption, of course, refers just to clothing communications as they cross this hostile path of the internet. So they're no longer electronically naked. Anybody can look at and do whatever they want with them. The counterswing of that is that you see governments alarmed by the idea that they might lose this pervasive access to all of our communications and all of our lives, that they might be returned to a paradigm in which they have no choice but to engage once again in targeted surveillance, because mass surveillance becomes less possible or less affordable. And so we've seen the rise of state-sponsored hacking to guarantee access even when communications are encrypted by going after individuals on that targeted basis. That's their last resort, being returned there. And the other part that we've seen is an increase in coercion, where companies are largely deputized by states, where they can get a voluntary relationship. This, of course, would be telecommunications service providers, primarily big bulk carriers. And then beyond that, when we talk like Silicon Valley companies and the internet giants, coercion is beginning to enter the menu where cooperation will not. This would be, such as the case we've seen, the letter written from the U.S. Attorney General, a UK minister, an Australian minister, all together to Facebook to request that they abstain from protecting the communications of their users and intentionally designing their products and services to be less safe for their users in order to make surveillance easier for governments. And then when we look at, as you say, more authoritarian models, look at the Chinese model, look at the Russian model, the Iranian model, and actually, unfortunately, even the Australian model, they're beginning to pass laws that say, look, if the government wants you to compromise the security of a service, you must cooperate or you're committing a crime. I think these companies, when they engage in a clandestine relationship with the government, when the government comes in and they say, look, we want you to provide a specific thing in a specific way, no one's going to know about it. It'll be classified. It's for national security purposes, or this, that, or the other. It's a limited time deal for a limited purpose. It sounds pretty good, and they go along with it. They never, I think, have a full understanding that that is the thin end of the wedge, right? That's the lowest bar. And the government is only going to ratchet up their access and the demands over time. As soon as they begin cooperating in part, they will ultimately end up cooperating in full, because the mere creation of the relationship, the creation of this system of providing information, was the original kind of sin. And once the government realizes there is a mechanism for access, once they can go to the courts and establish that this kind of horse trading, these kind of compromises have been granted in the past, that will be used as a basis to require and compel future cooperation that is far in excess, I think, of what, first off, they initially agreed to, and secondly, and ultimately, what they ultimately believed they could be asked for ever in the future. So yes, I do think it's fair to say there is always a failure of imagination in terms of what these relationships entail. Companies around the world need to understand generally, they need to consider this question of who do they ultimately work for? Why does their institution exist? Does it exist for the benefit of their customers and the public, or does it exist for the benefit of government? You have to have a real understanding of who your ultimate customer truly is. Oh, I think it definitely helps. Also, you might have liked Facebook, but I
People
think
liked Facebook. I'm sure people here liked Facebook.
I'm sure you could find a few who say they still do. But yeah. When you look at these kind of companies, and you get back to this question we were just considering, who is their customer? Their users are not their customer. And that was what gave rise to a lot of the abuses we saw prior to 2013, and I think is the ultimate lever by which abuses are being continually visited upon the public today. When you use Facebook, you are not their customer, you are their product. And it is unfortunately, in a lot of ways, true of Amazon's internet services as well. Amazon runs half the internet, and people aren't really aware of it. They're not familiar with it. They think of it as a place where you buy shoes. And it is that in one regard, but that's a very small fragment of their business, largely. And that digital portion of it gives them a greater and greater visibility over everybody's activities on the internet with each passing day. Now, we don't have a lot of evidence today to show precisely how this is being abused, but we know they have the capability, should they choose to use it, to do so. And we know they have incredibly intimate relationships with the United States government, particularly the intelligence community, because they built the CIA's data center, which they continue to operate today. So when we look at these things in the backlash in tech, I think this is actually one of the only means by which we've been able to effectively understand and police their activities today. We recognize now, in every language and every jurisdiction, that these companies have abused their platform, their position in global society today. The question before us really is what we are going to do about it in order to make sure that while yes, these services are useful in some ways to society, the ways in which they exploit their position must be moderated. GDPR honestly isn't good enough, and we know this by the simple fact that all of these prophesied fines of 4% of global revenue that would be applied to bad actors on the internet have yet to be applied to the bad actors on the internet. Until we see Google and Facebook and Amazon eating 4% of global revenue fines every single year, until they reform their activities, GDPR might as well not exist. But it is a start, and it is well-intentioned, and I think those kind of mechanisms are valuable until we start seeing them being used, and until we start increasing the ratchet to find more effective means of sort of regulating these behaviors, we're not going to get where we need to be. In terms of good versus bad internet, it's the internet of my youth, which I write about quite some length in my memoir, Permanent Record, was a creative and cooperative space. The commercialization of the internet was sort of a value-added part of it rather than the central purpose of it. Today, the internet has been transformed. That creative and cooperative space has been colonized and exploited and ultimately transformed into a competitive and commercial space, first and foremost. And that has been, I think, largely to the detriment of the public and the average user. It is also, I think, in a large way responsible for the increasing fracturing of society and the partisanship that we see today. It is by perhaps restoring this balance of what the internet is best used for, by limiting the ways we can be exploited. And I think the way this is largely driven today is through data collection. Companies should not be able to retain records about people's private lives for longer than is absolutely necessary for the accomplishment of their business purpose. It's fine to hold records for this period or that period to complete an order, to complete a transaction. But they don't need them a year later. They don't need them 5 years later. And they certainly don't need them going back to 1987, which is how long AT&T holds records of our telephone communications. The best thing that you can tell your customer to navigate the next generation of changes on the internet and really take a leadership position in the next generation of internet business is you don't need to trust us. You shouldn't trust us. And our services have been designed in a way that even if we are trying our hardest to screw you, we can't hurt you. And it is this trustless systems design, which is the basis of all computer security. This probably sounds strange to a lot of people, but in the context of information security, trust is considered a vulnerability. If you have to trust Facebook, you're in a very bad place. If you have to trust Microsoft, you're in a very bad place. If you have to trust Apple, Google, you're in a bad place. The next generation of services and products that are going to outcompete everyone else are the ones that are designed in such a way that you do not trust the services that are intermediating your communications. You trust only the people that are the ends of those communications, your friends, your community, the people that you are actually trying to connect with. That is the future of communications, and that's the future of privacy.